Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today for Nat Resources, we're going to talk about environmental health. and Part of environmental health might be things like forest fires or predictive measures of how to prevent forest fires. But not all of it is about the environment's health, but rather the health of individuals that live in that environment. So we're going to talk about both. We kind of already talked about ecosystems and ecosystem management a little bit. And now we're going to talk about how people fit into the ecosystem. How do they fit into it as far as taking resources? How do they fit into it as far as things like toxicology and other issues like that? Okay, so let's get started. First, health. Okay, health is defined as the complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and it's normally associated with humans. We can place, though, the healthiness or the health of an organism in here also. So we can talk about the health of, say, wild organisms, or the health of domesticated organisms, or whatnot. And in some cases, humans are the actors that are causing the health to or deplenish the physical or mental portions of that organism. In other cases, it's that another organism that might deplenish the physical, mental, and social well-being of organisms. For example, if you have a huge outbreak of cockroaches in your neighborhood and you're a relatively clean individual, clean because cockroaches are not actually dirty, but they do tend to infest areas that there's lots of food, free food for that matter. And your neighbor has cockroaches, and then they move into your house, and that could cause you some mental health issues, especially if you're, legitimately afraid of that invertebrate and of that insect. And so that insect could cause you that. And we'll look at some examples of these. Okay? Diseases. Okay, so a disease is just something that alters the normal body condition. It can be like a physical impairment. So you could have like a skin disease where it's visible, or you could have physiological disease where your neurons are affected, or your breathing is affected, or your blood flow is affected. So there's quite a bit of ways in which we can classify things as diseases. Okay, we'll talk about different ways that different ways in which health and disease can be affected, whether that be like nutrition or some types of infectious agents or toxic chemicals that are in the environment, trauma due to different types of stresses, and these kind of things, and the role that they play in morbidity, so developing illnesses, or mortality, death. And so we'll look at different examples of things that have occurred, and some in recent times, like the Flint, Michigan water issue, and we'll examine it from, well, what's the health of the individual? What's the morbidity that's caused? What's the mortality that's caused? And then, from that, we'll kind of estimate the, severity of the issue. And so one thing that I want to make sure that you understand is that when we talk about environmental health or environmental health risk, we're talking about all the pieces. And so, demonstrated here is you get all these puzzle pieces. Right? And these puzzle pieces are going to represent different types of risk, whether that be infectious agents, so viruses, bacteria, protozoans that might be in water sources, in the air, in your food. Well, then you have situations where you might have chemical pollutants in your water, or in your food, or in your air, or in the material that you might be wearing. You have all kinds of situations that could constitute some environmental health risk. We're going to examine some of these. I just want to make sure that you realize that maybe we're talking about an infectious agent like a bacterial infection. Well, that doesn't mean that there's not some kind of trauma involved, or not some kind of toxins involved, or radiation involved, other situations. You might have a bacterial infection, but the medicine that you might be taking in to destroy that bacterial infection might be doing just as much harm as the bacterial infection. The traveling from maybe a remote area where you might have a cold virus, but in order to go see your doctor, you're traveling 2-3 hours away by car, and you get in an accident. Now there's an environmental health risk, especially in areas where you might have high accident proneness. Right? So there's lots of ways in which these puzzle pieces can fit together. And we'll look at some of them. All right, so when we talk about global diseases, we need to talk about the burden that's placed upon the poor. Right? So the life expectancy increases. So the life expectancy of a population, whether this be a calculation of the population of a certain country, a certain city, a certain town, a certain village, okay? All of it's going to increase if you can decrease infant mortality. All right? And that should make sense to most of you. Okay? Remember, we were talking about logistic regression equations. And we talked about R, the rate of increase, is birth minus death plus immigration minus immigration. If your death rate is lower, then, and everything else is the same, then you should expect that your rate of increase should be better, or you should expect that, life expectancy in general might be better. Also from the perspective that humans are type 1 species. Remember that once we get over the infant hump, once we have, made it past infancy, we can live a long life, right? And we have a very low death rate until we get really old. And then once we get really old, 75 or more, then you start seeing it drop quite a bit. Once you get to 100, it drops, really rapid, with the life expectancy of a human being no more than 120 years. All right, but we can do this by calculating what we call DALYs. And so DALYs is the disability adjusted life years. And so what we can do is, depending on where the individual lives, where, what population they live in, what kind of risk they have, we can calculate, well, what's their chances of premature death, and what's the chances of losing a healthy lifestyle resulting in illness or disability. And that's what DALYs are. So we can put DALYs on different places in the world, and we do so. So we're basically adjusting what is your chance of dying before you reach, the age of 70 if you live in Wyoming. What's the chances if you live in Arizona? What's the chances if you live in Canada, Mexico, wherever? It doesn't matter. And we'd calculate DALYs for those different regions. Now, some of the alarming things that we've noticed most recently, that normally we thought kind of disease burden was a developing problem. So a country that's developing, or what we sometimes call third world countries, countries that are not rich, have high rates of disease. And we know this. But what we've seen lately is kind of a shift of the disease, we're starting to get diseases which we call rich people diseases, or well-to-do people diseases, or developed country diseases. And that's things like heart disease. And what most of the evidence suggests is that by 2020, we're talking 2 years away, that heart disease, heart attacks, and other complications with your heart will be the leading disability and disease worldwide. Well, what's the issue with heart disease? Heart disease is not well, if you're really malnourished, it's a deal. But if you're just, your typical developing country where there's enough food, but there's not plenty of food. Food is limited. If you're in a developed country, United States, Europe, China, Japan, food is not limited. Every single person in the United States, pretty much every single person in the United States, can literally walk out the door of their house, or if they don't live in a house, get up off the ground, and in that day period, in one 24-hour period, they can consume 2,000 calories and maintain their body. There are lots of other countries that's not the case. Food is limited. Heart disease is normally linked to high levels of calorie intake, high fat content, high salt content, high levels of energy coming in and not expending it. So by 2020, heart disease is going to be the leader worldwide. Well, this is normally considered a wealthy country problem, not a poor country problem. One that doesn't really pick or choose is cancer. So rates of cancer will increase by 50% by 2020. And so it's already on the rise. It's always been on the rise. Now, part of this might be our detection capabilities. We're much better at detecting cancer now than we were 10 years ago. But other things could be environmental conditions and things that we're exposing ourselves to in the environment. We'll look at some of these later. Nonetheless, though, the other thing that we see is North America has a huge issue. Okay? We have a huge issue with overeating, overconsuming energy, overconsuming carbohydrates, and it's a burden. It's a massive burden on the children of the United States, and it will be until we get a handle on it. Look at this. 1/3 of children born in the United States today in 2018 will develop diabetes in their lifetime. 1/3. One out of every 3 children, due to poor diet and little exercise. That's scary. I mean, that's pretty scary. Now, the other thing that we see, and WHO stands for World Health Organization, or WHO stands for World Health Organization, that we're going to start to see psychological conditions increase also. And this is to be expected, that as the disease burden, the cancer rates go up, the diabetes go up, the heart disease goes up, the burden on the environment goes up, the amount of high-level storms is up, the food resources is decreasing because we're starting to get to that carrying capacity of humans on the planet. You're going to start to see psychological conditions also increase. The burden of psychological disorders increase. And right now we think it's going to move within kind of the next 5 years from 10% to 15%. And then probably another 5% and then in the next 5 years after that. So we're expecting by 2050, so not too far out, that this could be upwards of 30% of the disease burden could be due to psychological disorders. And some of this, we don't know. It could be tied to poor diet, little exercise, and these other things. And there's pretty good evidence that suggests, at least diet-wise, can definitely help with psychological conditions. Right now, depression is a huge issue. And we expect it to be even greater as we progress. And like I said before, depression comes with other events. Having a child with diabetes, having a mother with cancer, a father with cancer, a brother with cancer, living in the path of a hurricane or tornado, or not having enough food for the table. Depression can be a really big deal and a major disability in all countries, not just developing countries, but the rich countries, the well-to-do countries. The other thing that's surprising, and it was a little bit surprising to me when I still look at the data that WHO produces. So the World Health Organization produces a lot of data for use, and you can check them out. You can go to their website and you can see all the numbers and things like that. But tobacco-related lung disorders or lung disease, whether that be cancer, emphysema, some of these other things, are on the rise. And it's the biggest single cause of death worldwide is tobacco use. That blows my mind. I mean, I don't remember the last time I saw a tobacco ad. I'm sure in magazines maybe there's some, but you don't even find them on billboards anymore. Sometimes when you walk into a grocery store, you'll see like a little sign by the tobacco area, but they're not on TV anymore. You don't hear about them on the radio any longer, and you hear the burden that tobacco puts on people's lives, yet it's still on the rise, and it's the biggest single cause of death worldwide. Infectious diseases. We're always thinking about infectious diseases. We always worry about, well, what if I get the next great bug? So what if the flu is really bad? What if I get this next bacteria? I mean, that's why we wash our hands with antibacterial soap, and most people are wiping their counters down with antibacterial wipes, and you don't want your kids eating things off the floor, the pavement, or licking a door handle, touching a bathroom stall, because we're really worried about infectious diseases. And for good reason, because infectious diseases are about 1/3 of the diseases related to death are from infectious diseases, communicable diseases, things that are passed from one organism to the next. But here's the kicker. Most of this occurs in countries with poor nutrition, poor sanitation, and a lack of vaccinations. I mean, we still have areas in the world, in Africa, for example, where 1 million kids, 1 million kids are dying from malaria. From malaria. If you get a malaria in Africa and you fly back to the United States, literally they give you a malarial drug and you're completely fine. But in Africa, the vaccination is so expensive that they don't provide it, and roughly 1 million children die every single year from malarial infections. And so a lot of this 1/3 of this infectious disease stuff is because we just don't have the money or the resources, or maybe we use the money and resources for other purposes, to help out with these infectious diseases. The other thing is most of you are fairly familiar with things like the Ebola breakout. Okay? We're afraid of things that are new. And Ebola is not new, but we're afraid of things that we don't understand or we don't have a vaccination to, and we should be. Okay? But it also causes a mass scare a lot of times, and it causes individuals to shut down borders and not allow individuals in and treat people very disrespectful, in my opinion. So this is my opinion. But we definitely know that new diseases or new outbreaks of a disease will definitely test what we call the defenses of development countries or developed countries. People will close borders. We did with Ebola. We've done so with Zika virus. We started screening people. We didn't allow people to go to those countries. Now, maybe for a good reason, maybe not for a good reason. I don't know. We have the vaccination for Ebola. We have the vaccination for Ebola. And so we know how to vaccinate for Ebola. We don't necessarily vaccinate for Ebola everywhere. There are lots of countries that currently have Ebola in Africa that we're not vaccinating them. Now, there is some circumstances on why we're not vaccinating them. First of all, they're at war, and we're not going to send doctors in to vaccinate people and get shot up. But it definitely tests our defense on how we're going to let people in this country and what we're going to do with them if they're infected. But we do know this. We know that as countries improve nutrition, sanitation, have clean water, the infectious diseases are almost all eliminated. Now, you can argue that if we eliminate malaria from Africa, that's another 1 million people every single year adding to the population. Now, maybe this is a good thing or a bad thing, or it's up to you, but I personally don't think allowing 1 million children to die every year is a good thing, regardless of the size of the population of the world. So by providing them with vaccinations and better water situations and things like that, we could eliminate a lot of these deaths. All right, so part of those disease-causing infectious diseases are due to pathogens. Now, pathogens can be viruses, bacteria, protozoans like malaria, parasitic worms, flukes, and things like that. There's all kinds of situations where there is a disease-causing organism, and we would deem them as being a pathogen. The largest loss of life from a pathogen occurred in 1918. And most of you have heard of the flu epidemic of 1918. About 100 million people worldwide died from this flu epidemic. And the flu is caused by a virus. And so 100 million people. And if you want to see evidence of this, you can really just go to any graveyard that is an old graveyard, and you can look at the grave markers. And majority of the people probably in that graveyard are going to be from 1918. It was a huge deal in the United States and a huge deal worldwide. Remember, in 1880, 1890, we're just above 2 billion people. And so, we're hitting the 2 billion people. We're a little over 2 billion in 1918 when we lost 100 million people worldwide due to a disease outbreak. It's a huge deal. We're at 7 billion, almost 8 billion now, so 4 times higher. That'd be like losing 400 million people today. That's the entire United States, and then some. Every single person in the United States, and then some. That's how many people died from the flu epidemic. It's a huge deal. Malaria is probably the key one, the major disease outbreak in tropical areas still, yet we have a vaccination for it. And like I said before, about 1 million people die each year. And we're going to watch a little video now about the potential to rid the world of malaria forever. And I want you guys to think about, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
These mosquito larvae in a lab at Imperial College in London have been genetically engineered to glow red under a laser. But that red fluorescence is just a marker. It's there to tell the researchers that something profound has happened.
I ran out and I grabbed my supervisor and I was like, Tony, you've got to look at this. So we started going through and I read them off one by one. I was like, red, 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 red. And it was a very crazy time. We just started screaming and getting super excited.
Since only one of their parents had a copy of the red gene, you'd expect around 50% of the larvae to be red, but nearly 100% of them were glowing. The researchers had hacked the rules of inheritance with what's called a gene drive. But the red gene isn't the point. It's been linked to a genetic tool that renders female mosquitoes infertile. And that's a huge deal because this isn't just any old mosquito species. This is Anopheles gambiae, one of the mosquitoes that carries the parasite that causes malaria.
So malaria is mostly a sub-Saharan African disease. It infects people in the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, but it's primarily a disease of sub-Saharan Africa, and the majority of malaria deaths in any given year in the world, hundreds of thousands of deaths, are kids under 5 in Africa.
Over the past 15 years, there's been a big investment in bed nets, insecticides, and better treatment.
I think the result has been a lot of steady progress on malaria. That being said, it's progress against a really, really high death rate.
Most African countries really want to try and eliminate. And WHO in support of this, they've set themselves some targets to achieve in 2030. And where we stand now, we don't seem to be on course for achieving those.
While researchers continue to work on a vaccine, genetic approaches to malaria look increasingly promising. Genetically modified mosquitoes aren't new. A company called Oxitec has released mosquitoes in Brazil that are designed to have non-viable offspring. But those don't contain a gene drive, which biases inheritance so that the modification continues to be passed through a population, though they can also be designed to have a more local reach. The idea of driving desirable genes into insect populations dates back decades, but progress toward that goal jumped ahead after the invention of the CRISPR gene editing tool in 2012. CRISPR allows scientists to make precise changes to DNA in the lab. A CRISPR gene drive could let them push those changes through a wild population of insects. It works by inserting the gene editing tool itself into a chosen segment of the mosquito's DNA. From there, CRISPR induces the cell to copy the package onto the matching chromosome. Like us, mosquitoes have 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. And now that the gene drive is on both chromosomes, it will get passed on to all the offspring, where it will copy onto their other chromosome, and so on. So depending on what biologists attach to that package, like the red fluorescent gene, they can make some drastic changes to wild populations. There are 2 broad approaches to malaria mosquitoes. The team at Imperial College is part of an international group called Target Malaria, funded mostly by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they're aiming to use gene drives to suppress mosquito populations. Their drives are designed to spread female infertility, or to prevent females from being born, with the effect of shrinking a population of mosquitoes. Then there's a team of researchers at the University of California institutions who have been developing a gene drive that alters rather than shrinks the mosquito population. It spreads genes that make mosquitoes resistant to the malaria parasite, so they don't transmit it between humans. The World Health Organization has outlined the steps that GM mosquitoes should go through before being deployed. Gene drive research is in phase 1 now, but to find out if it could really work, they need to test it outside of a lab. And the researchers say their mosquitoes should be ready for phase 2 soon.
I'm hoping the science is well within 5 years, maybe even half that.
Maybe in 1 or 2 years.
A couple of years, but then that's in the lab in London. After something ready in the lab in London, you'd really want to go through very rigorous testing.
So with every health intervention or technology, there's kind of a spectrum of how much testing and how much certainty people require before they just try it.
This is always a trade-off in any medical trial. If you develop a drug and it's like a miracle and it helps everyone, when do you stop the trial and just start giving that to everyone? Once we have a gene drive that we can release in the wild, that could wipe out malaria. Every year we don't do that is 500 to 700,000, mostly kids, dying. Kevin Esfelt, the MIT scientist who's working on gene drives, was talking to me, and he said,
I mean, malaria is a case where there's a strong ethical argument of doing something now, today, because so many children have died just in the time that we've been speaking. I would say at least 20.
And his takeaway for that wasn't, let's do this as fast as possible. It's, let's do this right, because if we don't do this right, then there's going to be a massive backlash and we're never going to be able to do anything like this ever again.
Yeah, if you move forwards with a unilateral, we are going to save the kids whether you like it or not, really does imperil the broader malaria eradication effort.
Target Malaria has begun a lengthy process of building facilities and staff in 4 African countries, where they'll be working with non-gene drive mosquitoes before importing the gene drive mosquitoes. And even then, there's more lab work to do before an actual release.
So the modified one is modified using a laboratory strain. So you really have to do experiments to make sure you incorporate the natural genetic background of the mosquitoes in the area where you want to work.
At each stage, they're consulting with local communities and with governments about this genetic technology that's designed to spread across borders.
No, there are no regulators that have handled this before, not only just in Africa, but anywhere.
I think I'm curious about, this notion that we have a public conversation, we need to get people on board, this notion that that would somehow lead to some clear consensus or some clear green light. At some point, someone has to decide, and I'm curious if you have a sense of who that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question, and no one I talked to even pretended to have the answer. The end game that got alluded to by a lot of people was some kind of agreement by the African Union about releasing a self-propagating drive. One tricky thing is malaria does not solely infect people in democratic countries like Ghana or Senegal. It also affects people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which despite the name is a dictatorship, countries with really unstable and in many cases really awful governance. So one tricky question is, if the African Union comes together and says, yeah, we're okay with this, is that legitimate? Are they speaking for people in Africa? And I think a lot of the work that scientists are doing is trying to reach out before that and trying to start a conversation before that to make sure it is legitimate.
As the public debate begins, there's a risk that the politics of genetically modified crops could spill over into the mosquito issue. Anti-GMO groups like Friends of the Earth have already called for a moratorium on gene drive research. They fear it will be misused by agribusiness and militaries and cause unintended damage to ecosystems.
We have safe and less risky ways of addressing problems on this planet that aren't about permanently altering nature.
No one in this is as big of a son of a bitch as nature. Nature is so awful in every conceivable way. It is completely indifferent to suffering, but I think many of the things we look back on as humans as our greatest achievements, getting rid of smallpox, penicillin, insulin for diabetics, mass vaccinations, those are all things that involved messing with nature and either repurposing or tweaking things that nature created for our own uses. Some of the worst things we've made have also done that, but I look at the earth as something we gotta keep going for us and for other animals. But I don't look at it as this morally benevolent place. It's a horror show that we're trying to manage as best we can, and this is a ambitious but really interesting way to manage it.
For a bunch more information about this fascinating topic, go read Dylan's feature article on Vox.com.
Okay, so there's just a piece of what's going on in today's world with CRISPR-Cas9 system, this gene editing system that we got from bacteria. So bacteria, when they're infected by viruses, they can utilize the virus DNA. So the viruses inject DNA into a bacteria. This is how they replicate themselves. When the virus injects that DNA, that CRISPR-Cas9 system is the immune system of the bacteria. And it grabs that DNA and it copies that DNA and puts it into a code to recognize, hey, I've already been infected by this virus, and now every time I see that genetic code, I'm going to cut it up and destroy it. Well, it was about 5 years ago that we figured out that we can also use that gene editing tool to edit DNA. And so in living organisms, we can take and have, a malfunctioning gene be removed and replaced with a functioning gene. Or, in this case, remove the ability for the organism to reproduce, or remove the ability for the organism to carry that pathogen. So I'm going to leave it there because the video is running a little long, and we're going to do part 2 of environmental health next.